Good day and welcome to Letters and Politics. I'm Mitch Jeserich. Since the invasion of Ukraine began, I have pledged on this radio program that we would explore the differing views, especially among the left, concerning the war in Ukraine. Today we continue to do just that with another perspective, this time with a leftist journalist who is critical of the anti-war left in this country and its discourse concerning the war. My guest is Bill Weinberg. Bill Weinberg is an award-winning 30-year veteran journalist in the fields of human rights, indigenous peoples, drug policy, ecology, and war. He is the author of the book Homage to Chiapas, The New Indigenous Struggles in Mexico, among other books. He covers world affairs, as he describes, from a dissident left point of view on his website and podcast. It's called countervortex.org. He was also a 20-year producer at Pacifica radio station WBAI in New York City. Bill Weinberg, thank you for taking this time to join me today.
It's an honor, Mitch.
Let's begin with how you see the war in Ukraine.
How I see it? Well, I think like most of the world, I see it as an illegal war of aggression by Vladimir Putin, and I support the right of the Ukrainian people to defend themselves. I live in New York's East Village, right in an area which is called Little Ukraine. I'm not of Ukrainian background myself, but my neighborhood is, the biggest Ukrainian neighborhood, certainly in New York City and possibly in the country. I think there might be a bigger one in Chicago. But the entire, Ukrainian community here in the neighborhood is speaking with one voice, of course, against the war and demanding international support, including arms and a no-fly zone for Ukraine. Now, I'm not ready to, get up on a soapbox and make policy prescriptions myself, but I am very alarmed at the tendency on the part of a lot of people on the left to, and for that matter, people on the right and people in the center, to speak over the voices of the Ukrainians themselves, and to sort of have the discussion about Ukraine without actually taking the Ukrainians into consideration, listening to what they are saying. So I think that there needs to be more of an honest grappling with what the world's responsibilities to Ukraine are at this moment, and if we're going to stand in solidarity with the Ukrainians against an illegal war of aggression, we have to at least listen to what they're saying. That's really where the conversation needs to begin.
Bill, I'm pretty sure since we've been doing these series of conversations, I've received many more emails than I usually do. Some of them are very happy. Some of them are very angry. One day they're happy. The other day they're angry. It could be from the same people as well. And I'm sure I'm going to get a good number of emails after our discussion as well, which is part of the deal of doing this. But I can already see the emails coming in saying, well, he's not really a leftist, a progressive, an anti-war guy, that, he's in the pockets of the CIA, the State Department, et cetera, et cetera. So can you just describe to me how you view your politics before we get really into this issue?
I have single standard anti-war politics, let's put it that way. Again, I see myself as in solidarity with people who are facing military aggression, regardless of whether they are in Gaza or Colombia or Ethiopia or Ukraine. And I reject campism and the notion that we should decide who we support in a conflict on the basis of what geopolitical camp they're in, as opposed to looking at local context and actually looking at the right and wrong of the situation.
You think that's what's happening now in the discourse here on the American left?
Yes, it's being influenced by campism and people deciding whose side they're on the basis of geopolitics entirely too much.
So one thing we hear a lot, and we've had a number of people on who nobody has said that Russia was right to invade Ukraine. And everyone we've had on has said, I would advise them not to have done that. But then they follow it up by saying, however, it's important to understand the context what led to it. And I know you know all the different reasons, and we could dive into each of these individually, but NATO expansion, controversies over the Maidan protests in 2014, really a civil war that we have seen in eastern Ukraine since. And so what people have said is that it's important to understand the context around to what would have caused Russia to invade Ukraine.
Right. And those people themselves are overlooking a lot of context in terms of what caused Ukraine to want to join NATO. I mean, as I pointed out over and over again, when Ukraine declared independence from the Soviet Union back in 1991, they said that they were going to pursue a demilitarized and neutral path. This was exactly the more progressive dissidents in the East Bloc, which I had been working to support at the time under the rubric of a group by the name of Neither East Nor West, which was opposing both NATO and the Warsaw Pact. This was exactly what they had been calling for. Dissidents in every country in the East Bloc there was a faction, at least a strong trend, which supported pursuing a demilitarized and neutral path for the former countries of the East Bloc after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the fall of the Soviet Union. And that was initially what was explicitly declared by the Ukrainian leadership upon independence from the Soviet Union in 1991. In 1994, the Ukrainian leadership willingly gave up the nuclear weapons which were left on their soil at the end of the Soviet Union in exchange for pledges which were made to them under the 1994 Budapest Memorandum that their borders and their territory and their sovereignty would be respected and the world would come to their defense in case they were attacked. They're one of the only countries on earth which actually gave up nuclear weapons. Kazakhstan and Belarus did at the same time. So what changed between that immediate post-Soviet era in the early 1990s to in 2019? Ukraine actually passed an amendment to their constitution, which codified their aspiration to join NATO. What happened in those intervening years? Well, Russia waged 2 wars in Chechnya. First, Yeltsin's war in 1995, and then Putin's war in 1999. Both times, the city of Grozny was massively bombarded. This horrific counterinsurgency war waged by the Russians. Okay, then you had the beginnings with 2004. You had the beginnings of a Russian destabilization campaign against Ukraine, which and meddling in their elections and so on, which resulted in the so-called Orange Revolution that year, in which the country began to tilt more away from Russia and more toward the West. Then in 2008, you had the Russian invasion of Georgia and supporting separatist movements on Georgian territory and essentially carving pieces out of Georgia's national territory. Then in the years after that, you had, particularly beginning in 2015, you had massive Russian aerial bombardment of Syria, the city of Aleppo virtually destroyed by Russian warplanes, and that's continuing right until now. The northern province of Idlib, which is the last area of Syria, last significant area of Syria, which remains outside the control of the Russian-backed Assad regime, is the northern province of Idlib, which, until, I suppose now, all those Russian warplanes have been called back home to bomb Ukraine. But until just a few weeks ago, Idlib was coming under Russian bombardment, even now, including civilian infrastructure. And then, of course, you had the whole crisis of 2014, which in Ukraine, where again Russia fomented separatist movements and militarily supported separatist movements on Ukrainian territory, illegally annexed the territory of Crimea. And it was only subsequent to all of this, that the Ukrainians abandoned their stance of seeking neutrality and actually codified in their constitution their aspiration to join NATO. Now, I think that the world being divided up into rival militarized power blocks, which we saw throughout the years of the Cold War, and now we're going back into that dystopia. Obviously, that's a completely pathological dystopian state of affairs, which is to be opposed. But you have to impose it. You have to oppose it intelligently, and it's not intelligent to merely, blame, NATO expansion without looking at the rest of the context as to, why the Ukrainian leadership chose to seek, NATO membership and to seek EU membership, and what were the pressures driving them to do that? And in fact, NATO, as Zelensky has repeatedly pointed out, NATO was not in any hurry for Ukraine to join. It's still years away at best. In fact, ironically, Putin's aggression may have just accelerated the process. But certainly, until a couple of weeks ago, that was years away at best. It isn't like Ukraine was being forced into NATO by NATO. Just on the contrary, Ukraine was appealing to a reluctant NATO for membership because it felt that it was under threat by Russia, and that perception that it was under threat by Russia has certainly been very dramatically vindicated.
I want to go back to Ukraine giving up its nuclear weapons. That's interesting, and they gave those weapons to Russia?
Yes, they ceded those weapons back to Russia. Yes,
and then when you said the whole world then agreed to come to Ukraine's defense if it was ever attacked. I mean, was this a treaty? Is this what do we mean?
It was the Budapest Memorandum, which actually it fell short of a treaty. It was not binding, but it was a declaration of principles, which was signed by Ukraine, Russia, and I believe the United States and United Kingdom.
NATO was formed to oppose, I guess, the Warsaw Pact, to oppose the Soviet Union, which is now we just have Russia. Is Russia not right to be alarmed by NATO expansion towards its borders and potentially eventually, and potentially, again, it didn't seem like it was imminent that Ukraine would join NATO, but a lot of people would say, Bill Weinberg, that if there was still a Warsaw Pact today and they try to go to Canada or Mexico and make those countries a member of the Warsaw Pact, the United States would have behaved the same way.
Well, are we in the habit of excusing United States behavior? I'm not quite sure I understand the logic of this argument. I mean, in fact, Cuba did bring Soviet missiles into their territory back in, 1962, I believe? 61?
Cuban Missile Crisis, yeah.
Cuban Missile Crisis, exactly. And, Kennedy's response was bellicose. I don't recall, leftists rallying around JFK during that episode. So I'm not quite sure I understand the logic of this argument. I mean, we oppose U.S. aggression where the U.S. has sought to, impose its geopolitical interest and its imperial aspirations by force. So pointing out that the U.S. would behave similarly, or in some cases has behaved similarly, is not an exoneration of Russia. I mean, really don't understand the logic of this argument. In fact, it's an indictment of Russia. If it's wrong when the United States does it, it's wrong when Russia does it, and vice versa. So I find this argument to be very amusing.
I think the argument comes from it's the realpolitik kind of a world. This is how power acts, outside of morals.
I will add, yes, I understand, but I will add that if Russia did not want Ukraine and Poland and the Baltic states to join NATO, then perhaps it could have refrained from, the whole litany of military aggressions that I just went through. Beginning with Chechnya way back in 1995, and going on through the invasion of Georgia, the massive military intervention in Syria, and finally, the illegal annexation of the Crimean Peninsula and the fomenting of separatist movements on Ukrainian territory, which all happened before Ukraine codified in its constitution, years before Ukraine codified in its constitution that its aspiration to join NATO. So, if in fact, Putin's motivation here is to prevent NATO encroachment to the east, everything that he's done has been completely counterproductive to that aim. And reading the situation, I think a little more objectively, I see Russia's aspiration to rebuild its empire.
Could it be argued that Putin has behaved this way because he did see NATO expanding to other former Soviet Union countries or states?
Yes, I suppose it could be said, although I'll point out that we're talking about actual Soviet states. Well, that didn't begin until 2004 with the Baltic states, Lithuania at least. But yeah, sure, it could be said. But similarly, it could be said that the U.S. began its destabilization campaign against Nicaragua back in the 1980s because it was perceived that it had gone over to the Soviet camp. It's not a justification.
And then there's the argument that, and I'm just going to keep coming with these arguments with you to get your responses to them. Then there is the argument that with NATO expansion and with Russia's response, that because these are two major nuclear powers, I mean, NATO is more of an alliance, but you know what I mean, sure. That the stakes are just too high to be playing these games at all, because even now this could all result in a nuclear war.
Well, I'm not quite sure I know what you mean by these games. Certainly, I do not dismiss the threat of escalation to the unthinkable, shall we say. Clearly, that exists. Absolutely. But I'm not quite sure I know what you mean by
that fair. That NATO expansion itself could lead to this tick for tack that has occurred, that eventually then would escalate into a nuclear war by expanding NATO towards Russia.
I'm not speaking in favor of NATO expansion, not by any stretch of the imagination am I speaking in support of NATO expansion. I think that it was an absolute tragedy that Ukraine went from a declared position of neutrality in 1991 to codifying in its constitution in 2019 its aspiration to join NATO. As I stated, the world being divided up into these rival militarized nuclear armed blocs is a completely pathological state of affairs. I'm not speaking in favor of NATO expansion. I'm speaking against NATO expansion, but an intelligent opposition to NATO expansion, which understands the Russian role in the process and does not, view Russia as a victim. The victim here is Ukraine. The victim is not Russia. Russia is the imperial aggressor in this situation.
This is Letters in Politics. Again, we are in conversation with Bill Weinberg. Bill Weinberg is an award-winning journalist. He covers issues concerning human rights, indigenous peoples, drug policy, ecology, and war. He's author of the book Homage to Chiapas, The New Indigenous Struggles in Mexico. You could read his work and also hear his podcast at countervortex.org. And he does join us for our continuing conversations and perspectives concerning the war in Ukraine. Bill, what is your take on what happened then in 2014? And let's begin with the Maidan protests that would result in the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych, somebody who was democratically elected.
Democratically elected, but did not rule very democratically. changed the Constitution to solidify his own power, stacked the judiciary, was ruling through a network of corrupt oligarchs and patronage and so on. And finally, what prompted the Maidan revolution was he rejected a proposed initial agreement with the European Union in favor of closer integration with Russia. And, this began as there's so much misconception about this. The gulf of perception between my Ukrainian friends here in the neighborhood and, my friends who are on the quote unquote left is just staggering, because, the popular perception on the American left is that the Maidan revolution was quote unquote a Nazi coup. Quote unquote, you hear this over and over and over again. And it's a complete reversal of reality. The Maidan revolution was a popular uprising from below, which began, in late 2013. Maidan Square in Kiev was occupied by protesters for that entire bitter winter, explicitly taking inspiration from the Occupy Wall Street protest here in New York City. And finally, Yanukovych was removed by a vote of parliament, not by force of arms, but by a vote of parliament after, a popularly supported, protest encampment in Maidan Square. And the politics of it, there were elements on the right which were merely anti-Russian, which were like extreme Ukrainian nationalists and merely anti-Russian. And there were also elements of it on the left, which were, socialist and anarchist and so on. But the main, the folks I would have supported and did at the time support, had the most sympathy for. But the main line, the mainstream politics of the Maidan protest, or the revolution of dignity, or EuroMaidan, as the Ukrainians call it, was pro-democratic and pro-European Union. And by no stretch of the imagination were the mainstream politics of the protest movement, quote unquote, Nazi. And by no stretch of the imagination was it a coup. Yanukovych was ultimately removed from power by legal means, by a vote of parliament. And this was after, there had been a protest encampment in Maidan Square throughout the entire bitter winter of 2013 to 2014. This is not a coup. This is absolute, utter revisionism. And, most Ukrainians view that as the beginning of a period of, democratic renewal and transparency and openness in their country. Not that, a Nazi regime coming to power, which is, the Putinist propaganda, which is just mindlessly echoed by entirely too many people on the left. The so-called left, I should say. And meanwhile, in Russia, or first let me point out, in Ukraine, there have been two peaceful transfers of power since the Maidan revolution. The most recent one in 2019, bringing Zelensky to power. Clean elections, normal transfer of power. In Russia, meanwhile, Russia's been led by one man, either as president or prime minister, Vladimir Putin, since 1999. And is the more and more autocratic power has been centralized in his personal rule, and it's just it's just gone over the edge into a totalizing dictatorship. Just in the past week since the invasion was launched, if people are going to start making analogies to classical fascism of the 1930s, 1940s, it seems to me that the fascists are in power in Moscow, not in Kiev.
Would you say that there were no fascists or Nazis that were involved in the EuroMaidan protest?
Well, I acknowledge that there were.
Yeah.
Didn't I? I mean, I said
yes,
that,
Yes, you did. Yes, you did.
And similarly, there are these kind of fascistic Ukrainian ultranationalist paramilitary groups, like the Azov battalion, which Putin exploits, and his propagandists just exploit to the kilt. I acknowledge that they're there. I acknowledge that they're ugly, but nobody talks about the equivalent elements on the Russian side. The Night Wolves, the Wagner Group, the Russian imperial movement, the various Cossack formations. There are just as many, ugly far-right paramilitary and mercenary factions on the Russian side. There's a complete double standard at work here.
Sticking with the EuroMaidan, do you think this was a dynamic that I think we see in many revolutions in countries across over the world, in the sense that to throw out a power, it oftentimes requires strange bedfellows, strange coalitions that once that power, that leader, I think we see this in Iran in 1979. I think we see this in Egypt in 2011. Once that the leader is toppled, then fighting breaks out among all these groups, which it doesn't seem, other than the East and West, Ukraine, I guess, is a little bit of a different dynamic, because instead of the more Euro-friendly aspects of the protest fighting with the fascist, they seem to come to at least some kind of a coalition afterwards. Is that wrong?
I'm not sure it's wrong exactly, but what happened in Iran, by way of contrast, there was a very clear break between the secular left and the clerical elements, and the clerical elements assumed absolute power. In Ukraine, there has not been a very clear break between the pro-democratic elements and the ultra-nationalist elements, but it's the pro-democratic elements which actually have power, and the ultra-nationalist and fascistic elements are like the Azov battalion and so on, are kind of operating in the shadows. Whereas in Russia, it is the ultra-nationalists who have power at the very top in the Kremlin. So once again, I'm not dismissing the threat of the Azov battalion and their ilk. And in fact, the socialist and anarchist groups in Ukraine, which I support and whose statements are on my website, countervortex.org, they oppose them. They're like, the bitterest enemies of the fascistic elements in Ukraine. So obviously I oppose the Azov battalion, goes without saying. But I also oppose Putin's cynical exploitation of the Azov battalion and, his completely perverse Orwellian talk about, he's going to denazify Ukraine in an illegal war of aggression, which, if you know your history, is the most ironic thing imaginable. I mean, it's just Orwellian levels of chutzpah. Vladimir Putin, who was, himself an ultra-nationalist who is now consolidating a kind of fascistic state and is waging an illegal war of aggression in Ukraine, does not have any moral legitimacy to oppose the Azov battalion. Okay, it is the pro-democratic elements in Ukraine who have some legitimacy to oppose the democratic left elements in Ukraine who have got the moral legitimacy to oppose the likes of Right Sector and the Azov battalion.
After these protests and the ouster of Viktor Yanukovych, another point of contention is, and then after the annexation of Crimea by Russia, another point of contention is then what seems to appear to have started a civil war that has occurred in the eastern portion of Ukraine, and there is an argument that the government of Kiev was bombing and suppressing eastern Ukraine, mostly Russian-speaking people.
Well, I mean, that's not an argument; that's a fact. I mean, of course, there was shelling, both sides of the so-called line of contact between Donbass and government-controlled Ukraine. There has been over the past. Over the past years since 2014, of course. And, it's a war and bad things happen in war. And undoubtedly there have been, human rights abuses and, targeting of civilian infrastructure and so on both sides. But there's this tendency to overlook the ugly little police state, which has been, consolidated within the the breakaway enclaves, the so-called People's Republics in the Donbass, and to just talk about the government shelling of the Donbass enclaves, as opposed to they've been firing shells back at government controlled territory. So it's gone both ways. And in contrast to the situation in Chechnya back in the 1990s, when it broke away from Russia, the separatist movement in eastern Ukraine was fomented by a neighboring country. I mean, it was militarily fomented and militarily supported by Russia, and that certainly had not been the case with. There hadn't been any outside power which had, fomented and militarily supported the separatist movement or the independence movement in Chechnya back in the 1990s.
Would it be an illegitimate reason for Russia if it was true, if they were concerned about Russian-speaking people in Ukraine who sort of seem to identify more with Russians, that they would want to help protect them in this war? Would they be wrong to do that if that's why they did it?
Would they? Well, they would certainly be wrong to do it the way that they in fact actually did it. Yes. I mean, encouraging a separatist movement, sending in these so-called little green men, actually sending in, covert military troops. I mean, when the U.S. has done this, when the U.S. has done this kind of thing in, Cuba and Nicaragua, which, similarly were seeking succor, as it were, from the rival superpower during the period of the Cold War, because they were in the backyard of the United States. People on the left opposed this. They didn't make excuses for it. Now, I suppose you've got a difference in that situation would be that you actually did have this Russian-speaking populace within eastern Ukraine, which felt that they were coming under, probably were in fact coming under some degree of discrimination. But all of those tensions really began in 2004 with Yanukovych, sort of playing to Russian ethno-nationalist sentiment in the east of the country, and trying to bring the country closer to Russia. Or just prior to that, prior to 2014, I should say. So, again, I am not here to, exonerate, ethno-nationalism on either side. Okay, but the notion that, Russia is, coming to the defense of its oppressed, compatriots is, again, overlooking a lot of very critical context.
Bill Weinberg, where do you think this split in the left when it comes to U.S.-Russian relations, international relations, comes from? Where do you think it begins? I mean, not only do we see it right now concerning the situation with Ukraine, we see it with Syria. I think you could make an argument that the same people are falling on the same sides with that situation in Syria as you would find here with Ukraine on both sides. I mean, does this come from the Cold War? Does this come from the Spanish Civil War? Does this come from Trotsky and Stalin falling out? How do you make sense? Because it does seem to have been a split, really, over the last 100 years that we consistently see.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned Spain, because Spain in the 1930s was very much seen as Hitler's test war, which and he was able to get away with the bombardment of cities like Guernica in Spain, and with backing a a fascist dictator ultimately who won power there in 1939, Francisco Franco. And he got away with it there, and then he felt like okay, I can move on to bigger and better things, and a world war followed. And I would argue that Syria was a test war for Vladimir Putin, where he successfully backed up basically a fascist dictator, Bashar Assad, who's been in power. If you include the entire dynasty, like the Somozas in Nicaragua, it's been the Assad dynasty in Syria, going all the way back to his father taking power, and I believe it was 1971. Succeeded when he was threatened by initially in 2011 what was initially a non-violent pro-democratic civil opposition, calling for a peaceful revolution, as had happened in Tunisia, having shorn up Assad's dictatorship and reconquered the country at such a terrible cost, and bombed cities into rubble on a scale like Aleppo, on a scale far outstripping what the Nazis did at Guernica, and he got away with it. He got away with it, and he felt that his appetite was whetted for bigger and better things, and now he's invading Ukraine very much as Hitler invaded Poland in 1939. So and the difference is that the progressive forces around the world were all behind democratic Spain back between 1936 and 1939, whereas the so-called progressive forces today were basically rooting for Russia in Syria between 2011 and the current day, and actually rooting for the fascist dictator, with rare principled exceptions. So it's very ironic. And there was a certain sense that just slavishly following the Kremlin line was perhaps forgivable up until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, because at least the Soviet Union was ruling in the name of socialism. I still think that it was a grave error for progressive forces around the world to just slavishly follow the Kremlin line during that period, but at least it was somewhat forgivable. Since then, it has not been at all forgivable, because Russia today is a savage capitalist state, not a savage communist state, but a savage capitalist state, run by oligarchs and openly nostalgic for the empire of the czars. So if this was perhaps a somewhat forgivable error in the era of the Cold War, it is no longer in any sense a forgivable error today.
I don't mean to get us too off track here, but were they so united in Spain? Wasn't there major fallout and fighting between communist and socialist anarchists?
Well, you're asking a very interesting question. And initially, after the attempted fascist coup of 1936, July 1936, which started the war, because the coup was not successful all over Spain. So Spain was divided after that between Republican, Democratic Spain, and Spain, which was controlled by the fascist generals, Franco and his co-collaborators. Initially, there was kind of an alliance between the Popular Front government in Madrid and the Spanish anarchists, who particularly seized power in Barcelona. That lasted for not quite a year before the Popular Front government, at the behest of Joseph Stalin, put down the anarchist experiment in Barcelona, and there was the so-called civil war within the civil war. So there was a kind of a dissident element, you might say, within the left at the time, which was supporting the Spanish anarchists. Were unequivocally opposed to Franco, but we're also opposed to the Popular Front government's repression of the anarchists in Barcelona. And similar today, you have dissident elements of the left, which supported the Syrian revolution, or supported the sort of anarchistic experiment of the Rojava Kurds in northeastern Syria today. So there are again, there's dissident elements within the left. That's why I call myself a dissident leftist. That's exactly what I mean by that.
A dissident from the left that you.
Well, a dissident within the left.
I guess I'm just trying to put my finger on here, not just with you, but with others as well. What is this divide about? What does it come down to? And I'm sure it's much more complicated than just one thing. But one thing I think about, it's funny, when I first started working at KPFA back in 2000, I remember being early on called a Trotskyist, and I didn't even know what that meant. I do now, but I didn't even know what that meant at the time. And it seems to me, if we go back to the early years of, even before World War II, you go back to the 30s, when you get the split. That's why I mentioned Trotsky and Stalin. And maybe I'm looking too much into this, and you'll let me know if so. But there's a split between Stalin and Trotsky, and it seemed to split the global left. It certainly seemed to split the left in the United States. You had those who would say, the Trotskyists, who would say that, Stalin is a totalitarian, a terrible person, creating an environment of misery for his people, and we should oppose him too. And then you had others on the other say, well, wait, this is still a socialist experiment. It is better than the empire of the West, the American empire, and we should support it still. Because it is opposing what some thought was an even worse evil, I guess. Does that make sense to you? Is that what's going on now, or do people look at Russia and say, at least it's opposing the Western powers that have been sort of running amok the past several hundred years?
Okay. I would certainly consider to be what Russia has done in Syria and in Georgia and in Chechnya as quote unquote running amok. That would definitely constitute running amok, in my opinion. And if you want to go back, hundreds of years, Catherine the Great also intervened. In Syria, against the Turks who were in control there, back way back in the day. If you want to go back, hundreds of years, Russia was also an imperial power, right? So this is exactly what I mean by campism. This tendency to view conflicts in some distant part of the world, not by actually studying what's really going on there and listening to the people from the region, listening to the people, who are our natural allies, the people who are fighting for democracy and human rights in the actual country, but instead viewing everything in terms of, we have to, in reflexive, unthinking manner, line up with the rival political camp to Washington, which is doing exactly the same thing that our supposed enemies do. Only instead of just uncritically lining up with Washington, we're like uncritically lining up with Moscow. I fail to see how that's any better.
As we approach the end of our time here, Bill, there's another critique out there that we are paying too much attention to Ukraine compared to wars that are happening all over the world. And I think there are many reasons why we are paying so much attention to Ukraine. I do think this seems to be resetting the geopolitical dynamics, and that's a reason. But, it's also a European country, white people, a lot of white people there. We don't nearly pay as much attention to, say, what's happening, for example, in Yemen with Saudi Arabia's war and invasion there.
Well, I just posted something on my website today, a write-up about the latest report from the United Nations about the situation in Yemen, warning of an imminent humanitarian catastrophe there. It's already a humanitarian catastrophe, but it got about to get much, much worse with millions facing starvation within a matter of months, unless there's some kind of imminent response. And of course, with the whole world now distracted by Ukraine, there's it's likely that there isn't going to be that kind of response, or at least let's be a little bit more optimistic and say that mounting the kind of needed humanitarian response in Yemen is going to be that much more challenging. So by all means, I dedicate my life to trying to, bring some light to underreported conflicts around the world. So I, by all means, think that we should be paying more attention to the situation in Yemen, as well as the situation, the place that I've been writing about these just in recent months, that probably most of your listeners have never heard of, such as, Nagaland, which is in northeast India, where there's an insurgency going on. And the government just committed a terrible massacre back there back in December, which resulted in an uprising. So by all means, I think that we should be paying more attention to the wars in these more obscure places. That said, it's precisely because those wars are in so-called obscure places, and of course that's an inherently subjective word, just like, that other problematic word, exotic. Those places are not obscure to the people who live there, okay? But for, the people who run the world, and those of us in the West, these are more quote unquote obscure places. Precisely because they're obscure, they are not likely to escalate to world war and an actual superpower confrontation. Whereas it is all too likely that could happen in the case of Ukraine. Okay, so that's a part of the reason that people are paying more attention to Ukraine. That's one thing that's to be said in response to that. Another thing that's to be said in response to that is that, very often people who I do not particularly, I've been noticing this on social media a lot, people who ordinarily don't have very much to say about Yemen are all of a sudden, bringing up Yemen. What about Yemen? In response to, all of the global outrage about Ukraine. And my response is, what about it? What about Yemen? Exactly. If Saudi Arabia is committing terrible atrocities in Yemen, then how does that let Russia off the hook for committing terrible atrocities in Ukraine? What about Ukraine? I mean, there's a word for this. It's a propaganda device, which has been called, whataboutery, where whenever the subject is the atrocities that are being carried out by the regime that you support, you start bringing up atrocities which are being carried out by other regimes. And that ultimately is propaganda exploitation of the Yemenis. That does not show any solidarity to the Yemenis. That is exploiting their suffering in order to justify the atrocities which are being carried out against the Ukrainians. All right. And the third thing I'm going to point out is that a big part of the reason that now millions of people are facing the imminent threat of starvation in Yemen is that Yemen gets approximately 30% of its wheat from Ukraine. And now those imports have all been cut off by the war. So, all these people who are trying to somehow let Putin off the hook by pointing to Yemen, well, Putin has just actually made things much, much worse in Yemen. Thank you very much.
By taking attention away from it?
No, by starting a war in Ukraine and cutting off a big source of Yemen's wheat.
Free me, I see. I mean, it seems to me, and maybe this is overly idealistic, if we were to put the same amount of attention on Saudi Arabia, and of course we're not because this is a U.S. ally, but if we were to put the same amount of attention, including taking actions such as many of the financial actions, maybe you can even call it financial warfare, that has been directed towards Russia, I could be for that if that was something we did every time a country invaded another sovereign country that wasn't under imminent threat from that country. That'd be a great way to stop war, it might be. But of course, that's not how it's done. It's inconceivable of that ever happening to the United States or to so many other countries. So I mean, why all of this towards Russia, not these other places?
Well, when you say all of this, you mean economic sanctions and so on?
Economic sanctions, military.
I am among the people who, have been calling for, so-called BDS, boycott, divestment, sanctions against Israel. So now, obviously, there's, geopolitical reasons that Israel can get away with its, periodic savage bombardment of Gaza with complete impunity. And that there's all this global outrage when Russia is doing essentially the same thing in Ukraine. I understand the geopolitical reasons for that, but that doesn't let Russia off the hook. And in fact, the fact that Russia is being held to some kind of account in terms of sanctions and so on could set a precedent which we could invoke to strengthen the case for sanctions against Israel if we played our cards better than thus far we have, we meaning progressives, broadly speaking. But we're completely undercutting our own moral position if we're going to, start making excuses for Russian aggression in Ukraine.
Bill Weinberg has been our guest. Again, Bill Weinberg is an award-winning 30-year veteran journalist in the fields of human rights, indigenous peoples, drug policy, ecology, and war. He's the author of the book, Homage to Chiapas, The New Indigenous Struggles in Mexico. You could read his writings and hear his podcast online at countervortex.org. He has joined us in our continuing effort to bring differing perspectives to the war in Ukraine. Bill Weinberg, I do thank you greatly for taking this time to join us today.
Well, I thank you and salute your courage and, being willing to air these perspectives, Mitch.
I'm going to forward all the emails to you, Bill.